My name is Eloan Cartwright, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 62 years old, and I need to tell you about the day my first grandchild was born, and how a nurse's whispered warning exposed a 40-year lie that destroyed my entire family. It was October 15th, when my daughter-in-law Sephora went into labor. My son Bastian called me at 6 in the morning, his voice shaking with excitement. "Mom, it's happening," he said. "We're heading to the hospital." My husband Calloway and I rushed to Phoenix General Hospital, arriving just as Sephora was being admitted. The labor was long, almost 14 hours. But at 8:17 that evening, my grandson was born, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, perfect in every way. They named him Griffin. I held him in the hospital room while Sephora rested, and Bastian called relatives with the good news. Everything seemed perfect. I had no idea my world was about to shatter. The next morning, I returned to the hospital early. Calloway had stayed home to rest, planning to visit later. I wanted to help Sephora with anything she needed and spend more time with baby Griffin. A nurse came in around 9 to do routine checks and paperwork. Her name tag said Tempest Ashford. She was maybe 50, with kind eyes but a serious expression. She checked Griffin's vitals, made notes on her tablet, then asked Sephora some standard questions about feeding and pain levels. Everything seemed normal until Nurse Tempest was about to leave the room. She paused at the door, glanced at me, then came back and handed Sephora a folder. Inside were the baby's first health records, including blood type documentation. Griffin's blood type was listed as B positive. Sephora looked at it and smiled, saying her baby was healthy, but Nurse Tempest's face remained serious. Nurse Tempest glanced at the door, making sure no one was in the hallway. Then she did something strange. She pulled out a second sheet of paper from her pocket and quietly switched it with the blood type paperwork in the folder. The new sheet showed Griffin's blood type as O negative instead of B positive. Before Sephora or I could ask what she was doing, Nurse Tempest leaned close to me and whispered 6 words that would haunt me forever. "Check your husband's medical record." Then she straightened up, smiled professionally, and said in a normal voice that everything looked great and she'd be back to check on them later. She walked out quickly, leaving me frozen in confusion. Sephora asked what the nurse had whispered. I lied and said she was just reminding me about visiting hours. But my hands were shaking as I held that switched paperwork. I excused myself and went to the hospital cafeteria, my mind racing. Why would a nurse switch blood type paperwork? Why would she specifically tell me to check Calloway's medical records? It didn't make sense unless she was trying to tell me something without directly saying it. I pulled out my phone and searched for information about blood types and inheritance. What I found made my stomach drop. Parents with certain blood type combinations can only produce children with specific blood types. It's basic genetics. If the baby's real blood type was B positive as originally listed, and if Bastian and Sephora's blood types were incompatible with producing a B positive child, then I stopped that thought immediately. No, that was impossible. But Nurse Tempest's warning kept echoing in my mind. I needed to know Bastian's blood type and Sephora's blood type to understand why this mattered. I called Bastian's phone. He was in the hospital gift shop buying flowers for Sephora. I asked him casually if he knew his blood type. He said he was a positive, had known since high school when he donated blood for the first time. My heart started pounding. I asked if he knew Sephora's blood type. He said she was A positive too. Same as him, they joked about it once. I thanked him and hung up quickly before he could hear the panic in my voice. Then I looked up the genetics again, my hands trembling. 2 A-positive parents can produce children with blood type A or O. They cannot produce a child with B-positive blood. It's genetically impossible. Griffin's original paperwork said B-positive, which meant either the hospital made a terrible mistake, or Griffin wasn't Bastian's biological son. But I'd watched Sephora throughout her pregnancy. There was no way she'd cheated, which left only one other explanation. The explanation I didn't want to consider. What if Bastian wasn't actually A-positive? What if his blood type had been wrong all this time? But that seemed unlikely. He donated blood multiple times. They test thoroughly unless the problem wasn't with Bastian's blood type. My mind went to Nurse Tempest's specific words. Check your husband's medical record. Not check Bastian's, check Calloway's. My husband of 40 years. Why would my husband's medical records matter to my grandson's blood type? The answer hit me like a physical blow. The only way Calloway's blood type would matter is if Calloway was Griffin's grandfather through Bastian, which meant Calloway would need to be Bastian's father, which he was unless he wasn't. I sat in that cafeteria for 20 minutes, staring at my phone, unable to breathe properly. Was Nurse Tempest suggesting that Calloway wasn't Bastian's biological father? That I had somehow no, that was insane. I'd never cheated on Calloway. Never, not once in 40 years. But doubt is a terrible thing once it takes root. I started thinking back to when I was pregnant with Bastian 32 years ago. Calloway and I had been married 8 years, trying to conceive for most of them. We'd almost given up when I finally got pregnant. It was the happiest time of our lives. The pregnancy was normal, the birth was normal. And Bastian looked like both of us. He had Calloway's dark hair and my green eyes. No one ever questioned his parentage. Why would they? But what was Calloway's blood type? I realized with shock that I didn't know. In 40 years of marriage, it had never come up. He'd never needed surgery or donated blood that I knew of. I just assumed we were compatible matches. I needed to find out. I went back upstairs to Sephora's room. She was nursing Griffin, while Bastian dozed in the chair beside her bed. I told them I was going home to bring back some items they'd forgotten. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with terrible possibilities. At home, I went straight to Calloway's office. He kept meticulous records of everything, including medical files. I found his filing cabinet and searched through labeled folders. There had to be something with his blood type. Finally, I found a folder labeled Medical Calloway. Inside were decades of doctor visit records, prescription receipts, and insurance forms. I flipped through frantically until I found what I was looking for. A doctor's visit from 15 years ago when Calloway had a minor surgery to remove a benign cyst. The pre-surgery paperwork listed his blood type clearly, O negative. The same blood type Nurse Tempest had written on the switched paperwork for Griffin. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped the papers. O negative and O negative cannot produce an A positive child. It's genetically impossible. If Calloway was O negative and Bastian was a positive, then Calloway could not be Bastian's biological father. I sat on the floor of Calloway's office, surrounded by scattered medical papers, trying to understand what was happening. I had never cheated on my husband. Never. The idea was absurd, but the genetics didn't lie. Bastian was a positive, Calloway was O negative. Those two facts could not coexist if Calloway was Bastian's father, which meant either the blood types were wrong, or something had happened 32 years ago that I didn't know about. Then a memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought about in decades. When I was trying to get pregnant, Calloway and I had gone to a fertility clinic. This was back in the early 90s, when such treatments were newer and less regulated. We'd done 3 cycles of intrauterine insemination. The 3rd cycle had worked, resulting in Bastian's conception. I'd always assumed they'd used Calloway's sperm for the procedure. But what if they hadn't? What if there had been a mistake at the clinic? What if they'd used donor sperm and never told us? I needed to find records from that fertility clinic. I searched through more of our old files, going back 30+ years. Finally, in a box in our storage closet, I found a folder labeled Phoenix Fertility Associates 1992 to 1993. Inside were consent forms, treatment schedules, and billing statements. I read through everything carefully. The consent forms we'd signed authorized the clinic to perform IUI using Calloway's collected sperm. There was no mention of donor sperm anywhere, but there was a handwritten note on one of the procedure reports, dated the day of the successful insemination. The note said, "Sample substitution, see Dr. Vernon." I stared at those 3 words. Sample substitution, what did that mean? Had they substituted Calloway's sample with someone else's? Why would they do that? I looked for any reference to Dr. Vernon in the other paperwork but found nothing. Phoenix Fertility Associates had closed down over 20 years ago after some kind of scandal. I vaguely remembered reading about it. I spent the next 2 hours searching online for information about Phoenix Fertility Associates and Dr. Vernon. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. The clinic had been shut down in 2003, following an investigation into unauthorized use of donor specimens and falsified consent records. Multiple families had sued after discovering through DNA tests that their children were not biologically related to the fathers who'd raised them. Dr. Harlan Vernon, the clinic's director, had been using his own sperm and sperm from a small group of donors without patient consent. He'd told patients they were receiving their husband's sperm while actually substituting other samples. He'd done this to hundreds of couples over a decade. The lawsuits had been settled quietly, and Dr. Vernon had lost his medical license. But the damage was done. Dozens of families discovered their children were not genetically related to their fathers. I felt sick. Bastian could be one of Dr. Vernon's victims, which meant I was a victim too. We'd consented to use Calloway's sperm, but they'd given me someone else's. I needed to talk to Nurse Tempest. She clearly knew something. I drove back to the hospital, my mind reeling. I found her at the nurse's station on the maternity ward. I pulled her aside and asked if we could speak privately. She looked nervous but agreed. We went to a small consultation room. I closed the door and demanded to know why she'd switched Griffin's blood type paperwork and told me to check Calloway's medical records. Nurse Tempest took a deep breath. She said she'd worked in the maternity ward for 28 years. She'd noticed over time that certain families had blood type combinations that didn't make genetic sense. Usually, it was a sign of infidelity, and she stayed out of it. But several years ago, she'd noticed a pattern. Families who'd used Phoenix Fertility Associates in the early 90s often had these impossible blood type combinations. She'd started quietly investigating and discovered the Dr. Vernon scandal. She realized the hospital had been delivering babies for decades who weren't biologically related to their fathers because of that clinic's crimes. Nurse Tempest explained that when she saw Griffin's blood type was B positive and knew both parents were A positive, she'd checked the family history. She saw that Bastian had been born in the same hospital 32 years ago. She'd pulled his birth records and saw that Sephora and I had been patients of Phoenix Fertility Associates. She'd cross-referenced with blood types on file. When she saw that Calloway was O negative, she knew immediately that Bastian couldn't be his biological son. She'd faced an ethical dilemma. Hospital policy said she couldn't disclose this information directly, but she also couldn't let another generation go by without knowing the truth. So she'd switched the paperwork to show Griffin's blood type as O negative, matching Calloway's, hoping I'd notice the genetic impossibility and investigate. She'd whispered the warning to point me in the right direction. She apologized for the deception, but said she'd seen too many families torn apart by secrets. Better to know the truth and deal with it than live a lie. I asked Nurse Tempest if she knew who Bastian's biological father was. She said she didn't have access to that information, but the old fertility clinic records had been subpoenaed during the lawsuits and were now stored with the state medical board. Families affected by Dr. Vernon's crimes could request DNA comparison through a victim's database that had been established. I could apply to access it, but first, I needed to confirm with DNA testing that Calloway truly wasn't Bastian's father. I couldn't blow up my family based on blood type evidence alone, even though the genetics seemed clear. I thanked Nurse Tempest for her courage in telling me. She squeezed my hand and said she was sorry I had to go through this. I left the hospital without going back to Sephora's room. I couldn't face my son knowing what I now knew. I needed proof first. I needed to understand the full truth before I destroyed 40 years of family history. That evening, I sat Calloway down at home and told him everything. I showed him the medical records, the blood type evidence, the information about Phoenix Fertility Associates, and Dr. Vernon's crimes. I watched his face go from confusion to disbelief to devastation. He aged 10 years in 10 minutes. We both cried, neither of us had known. We'd trusted that clinic to use his sperm, and they'd betrayed us. Calloway asked if I was sure. I explained the genetics clearly. O negative plus O negative equals only O negative children. Bastian was A positive. It was impossible for Calloway to be his biological father. We'd been lied to for 32 years. Our son wasn't genetically ours. Well, he was mine, but not Calloway's. Calloway broke down completely. He'd raised Bastian, taught him to ride a bike, helped with homework, celebrated every achievement. And now, he was being told that biological connection didn't exist. I held him while he sobbed. This wasn't his fault. It wasn't my fault. We were victims of a criminal doctor. We decided we needed DNA confirmation before telling Bastian. I contacted a private DNA testing company and arranged for Calloway to submit a sample. I used a cotton swab to collect DNA from Griffin's pacifier at the hospital without anyone knowing. The lab could test grandfather-to-grandson genetic markers. If Calloway was truly Bastian's father, there would be a clear genetic connection to Griffin. If not, the test would show no relation. The results took 5 days. Those were the worst 5 days of my life. Calloway barely spoke. I tried to act normal around Bastion and Sephora, cooing over baby Griffin while my heart was breaking. Finally, the results came back. I opened the email with shaking hands. The report was definitive. Calloway and Griffin shared no genetic markers consistent with a grandfather-grandson relationship. 0% probability of relation. Calloway was not Griffin's grandfather through Bastion, which confirmed Calloway was not Bastion's biological father. We had our proof, now we needed to find out who was. I contacted an attorney named Investigator Locke, who specialized in fertility fraud cases. She'd handled several Phoenix Fertility Associates victim cases during the original lawsuits. She explained that Dr. Vernon had primarily used two sources for substituted sperm: himself and a small group of medical students he'd paid as donors. There was a database of known offspring from these donors. If I submitted Bastion's DNA to the database, they could potentially identify his biological father. But I needed Bastion's consent, which meant I had to tell him the truth. Investigator Locke warned me this would be traumatic for everyone. Bastion would learn the man who raised him wasn't his biological father. Calloway would have to process that his son wasn't genetically his, and somewhere out there might be biological half-siblings Bastion never knew existed. But living with the lie seemed worse. I decided to tell Bastion and let him choose whether to pursue the DNA database search. He deserved to know the truth about his origin. 2 weeks after Griffin was born, Calloway and I asked Bastion to come over without Sephora and the baby. We said we needed to discuss something important. Bastion arrived looking worried, asking if someone was sick. We sat him down and I told him everything. The blood types, the Phoenix Fertility Associate scandal, Dr. Vernon's crimes, the DNA test results. I watched my son's face crumble as he processed what I was saying. He kept asking if we were sure. We showed him all the evidence, all the records. Finally, he accepted it. Then he asked the question we'd been dreading. So who is my real father? I explained about the database and the possibility of finding out. Bastion was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Calloway and said something that made us both cry. He said Calloway was his real father. Biology didn't change that. Calloway had been there for every moment that mattered. But he wanted to know the truth about his genetics. For medical history, if nothing else. He agreed to submit his DNA to the database. The database search took 3 weeks. The results came back with a match. Bastion's biological father was Dr. Harlan Vernon himself. The doctor who'd run the fertility clinic had used his own sperm to impregnate me without consent. I felt violated in a way I couldn't describe. This man had essentially assaulted me with his genetic material while I'd been trying to have a child with my husband. It was monstrous. Investigator Locke explained that Dr. Vernon had done this to at least 87 known families. He had biological children scattered across 3 states who'd grown up not knowing their true parentage. Many had discovered the truth the same way we had, through blood type discrepancies or DNA tests. Dr. Vernon had died in 2015, so criminal prosecution was impossible. But Investigator Locke said we could join a civil lawsuit against his estate for emotional damages. Multiple families had already filed. We decided to join the lawsuit, not for money, but for justice and acknowledgement of what had been done to us. That was 8 months ago. Bastion, Calloway, Sephora, and I are still processing everything. Bastion has connected with 3 of his biological half-siblings, all children of Dr. Vernon, through the same fertility fraud. They've formed a support group. Calloway and Bastion's relationship actually grew stronger through this ordeal. They realized that love and commitment matter more than genetics. The lawsuit is ongoing. Our family joined 43 other families seeking damages from Dr. Vernon's estate. Baby Griffin is now 8 months old and perfect. He'll grow up knowing the truth about his family's complicated genetics, but also knowing he's surrounded by love. Nurse Tempest retired last month. I sent her flowers and a thank you card for having the courage to tell me the truth. Without her, we might never have known. And while the truth was painful, living a lie would have been worse. I'm 62 years old, and I learned that family is defined by love and choice, not just biology. But I also learned that medical professionals hold tremendous power, and when they abuse it, the damage echoes through generations. They say ignorance is bliss, but I disagree. Living with a lie, even when you don't know exists, creates a foundation of sand. Eventually, the truth comes out. And when it does, everything built on that lie collapses. I'm grateful Nurse Tempest had the courage to tell me, even though she risked her career to do it. The hardest part wasn't learning that Calloway wasn't Bastion's biological father. The hardest part was realizing I'd been violated by a doctor I'd trusted. Dr. Vernon used my body to further his own twisted agenda, without my knowledge or consent. That's not medicine, that's assault. But here's what I want you to understand. Genetics don't define family. Calloway raised Bastion with love, patience, and dedication. He taught him right from wrong, supported his dreams, and was there for every milestone. Biology can't compete with that. Bastion calls Calloway Dad because that's who Calloway is, his father in every way that truly matters. If you're watching this, and you used fertility treatments decades ago, especially in the 80s or 90s, I encourage you to look into the clinic's history. Many have been involved in similar scandals. Blood type discrepancies in your children or grandchildren might not be what you think. It might not be infidelity, it might be medical fraud. And to medical professionals, your patients trust you with their most intimate hopes and dreams. Honor that trust because when you betray it, you don't just hurt one person, you damage entire families across generations. Family is complicated, truth is painful, but lies are worse. Dr. Harlan Vernon's estate settled the class action lawsuit for $12.3 million, divided among 87 affected families. Bastion and his three half-siblings remain in contact and consider themselves family. Before you go, I need to know something. What hit you the hardest, the betrayal? The moment everything fell apart? The twist you never saw coming? Drop it in the comments right now. And tell me what you want to see next. Medical fraud, family secrets, financial crimes, hidden identities. Your ideas become our next stories. If this story kept you glued to the screen, hit that like button. If you want more shocking true stories that expose the truth, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Thanks for letting me share this story with you. The next one drops soon, and it's going to shake you even harder. See you there.